4 armed men surrounded my house at dawn. My hands trembled as I watched them move with the kind of practiced coordination that suggests rehearsal, not spontaneity. They said they had a warrant for my wife. For what? I couldn't imagine. She hadn't even had a speeding ticket. The leader's polite, cold smile crawled under my skin as he demanded we open up. Everything about it felt off. Then my wife came to the door, and whatever confidence those men had evaporated the moment she stepped outside. Their posture collapsed like a stage set when the spotlight hits a real actor. What could she possibly have done to make grown men with guns look like children caught in a lie? If you want to know what happened next, read on. I was getting ready for work when the men spread around the house, each taking a position with unnerving precision. One avoided the doorbell camera, another stood where our motion sensor rarely reaches, and one planted himself beside the side gate with the broken lock we never got around to fixing. How did they know about that lock? The answer came in a voice that carried down our quiet street. We have an arrest warrant for Sarah Thompson. Curtains twitched, neighbors peered out. In the 3 years we'd lived here, we'd never experienced anything like this. From the peephole everything looked official. Sidearms, holstered clipboards, radios chattering. But their choreography was too exact. The leader checked his watch and kept glancing toward the driveway where Sarah's car sat. Did they know her routine? Mine? A cold realization slid down my spine. Real police don't move like they're following a script of your life. I cracked the door, chain on, and asked what this was about. The tall man read off a sheet like a rehearsed line. My wife was wanted for obstruction of investigation and interference with municipal procedures. He handed over paperwork, a county seal, purported judge's signature, stamp, say everything a magistrate might expect to see. Then my eyes snagged on a county code and I froze. Jefferson County, Jaya 2847. We live in Madison County. Any real officer would know that. Any legitimate warrant would too. This was fake, expensive, carefully forged, but fake. The leader's tone shifted to urgency and, briefly, threat. The details that had seemed incidental piled up into something terrifying. They'd avoided the cameras deliberately. They knew the exact blind spots. They knew the broken gate lock we'd told no one about. They stood where our garage sensor never trips, a vulnerability I'd only noticed recently. How could strangers know the skeleton of our security? I shut the door to buy a few seconds and listened to the house vibrate with the noise outside. Neighbors whispering, radios crackling, boots scuffing gravel. My mind landed on the only explanation that fit. Hey, someone had been watching us, cataloging our routines, collecting data. This wasn't a mistake. It was a plan. Michael? Sarah called from upstairs, calm and completely unaware. What's going on down there? She had no idea that men with guns and fake documents were claiming legal authority to take her away. I told her the truth as delicately as I could. Some officers are here. They have a warrant for your arrest. They shifted as if preparing for resistance. Then Sarah walked out of the house in full Metro Police detective uniform, a badge glinting, duty belt stocked, radio buzzing with authentic dispatch traffic. The change in those imposters was immediate and absolute. The lead man's confident posture failed. His clipboard started to tremble. You could practically see their bravado crack like cheap paint. Gentlemen, she said with the quiet authority of someone who'd trained for moments like this, I'm Detective Sarah Thompson, Metro Police Department, Badge 1247. You're attempting to claim arrest powers over a sworn officer. She didn't shout. She didn't wave a weapon. She didn't need to. Her presence, expertise, and calm unmasked them faster than any accusation could. They fumbled. He tried to insist they had legitimate authority. She tilted her head in that same patient way she used on suspects who thought they were clever. She asked for badge numbers, department authorization, supervising officer contact. Each question landed precisely where it hurt. They hadn't planned for facing a real cop who knew the right questions to ask. Sarah keyed her radio with fluid efficiency. Dispatch, Detective 1247 requesting warrant verification for Sarah Thompson. The authentic crackle of professional dispatch answered, negative on all warrants, no outstanding orders. The imposters' faces went from nervous to terrified as the truth closed in. You're impersonating officers with false documents, Sarah said, steady, multiple felonies. I'm placing you under arrest." The lead pretended there must be some confusion. Sweat shone on his brow despite the cool morning. Sarah gave him that cold, compassionate smile reserved for people whose audacity outruns their preparation. "No confusion," she said. "You presented fraudulent credentials and attempted an unlawful arrest. Only confusion is why you thought this would work." Real backup arrived and the scene shifted into official procedure. Actual patrol cars, actual officers who knew their roles. As Sarah coordinated the arrests, I studied their fake warrant again. The county code was wrong, but everything else was alarmingly accurate. They had our full address, down to numbering we don't list publicly. They knew Sarah's name, her badge number, and intimate details about our routines that should have been impossible for strangers to collect. Seeing the imposters cuffed should have felt like a triumph. Instead I felt unsettled. Random criminals don't spend weeks crafting believable warrants and doing sophisticated surveillance. They don't map camera blind spots, log broken locks, and gather internal police schedules. Whoever did this had access, time, and technical skill. Someone had been watching us, studying our lives, compiling precise intelligence over weeks and maybe months. Not long after, a detective from Metro Esteti, experienced man named Smith arrived to take the case. He laid out evidence on our kitchen table, crime scene photos and detailed house diagrams that made my skin crawl. These weren't casual sketches. The drawings showed furniture placement, electrical outlets, even the location of our bedroom safe, details only someone with regular access to our home could know. Smith's conclusion was blunt. This wasn't random. This was systematic surveillance carried out by someone we trusted. That afternoon our neighbor, Tom Miller, knocked with a manila folder. Tom, a retired electrical engineer, had always been the kind of person who notices the small technical anomalies others miss. He opened the folder and spread out his own printouts and notes, timestamps, screenshots, and meticulous observations from his new security system. He had been tracking unusual activity in the neighborhood for months and, without realizing it at first, had documented a pattern. Tom had identified a woman, Karen Wells, who had been visiting houses during standard work hours, claiming to be conducting home emergency inspections for insurance compliance. She carried an official-looking clipboard, sometimes possessed keys to houses on the street, and seemed to have legitimate access. Tom's timeline and technical logs made it clear. Someone posing as a legitimate inspector was entering homes and collecting detailed information at the very kind of intelligence used to plan the morning's fake arrest. Everything snapped into place in the most unsettling way. The forgeries, the mapped blind spots, the precise knowledge of our routines. This was not an amateur prank. It was an inside job wrapped in the appearance of authority. Yesterday's raid made me look at Karen in a new light. A few days later, Detective Smith called with the lab results from the surveillance papers seized from the imposters. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice suddenly animated, the kind of excitement you hear when a tiny lead might blow the case wide open. The forensic team had found traces embedded in the paper fibers, cake flour and real vanilla extract, the proportions consistent with high-end baking. In short, someone had been handling baking ingredients while drafting or reviewing those house layouts. That very evening Karen showed up on our porch with her routine cookie delivery, and that same too bright smile I'd started to find unsettling. She was polished and friendly in that way people use when they want to belong to every conversation. She'd been bringing us cookies since we moved in, explaining it as part of her whole community outreach. I'd always accepted it as harmless neighbor line. Sarah liked the treats, and I didn't want to be rude. Now, with the lab results in hand, everything felt different. Sarah wasn't home from her shift, so I kept my voice light and put my phone in my pocket to record. "These are amazing, as always," I said. "What flour do you use? You bake so well." Karen's face brightened like I'd asked her to recite a favorite poem. "Oh, I'm very particular," she gushed. "I only use special cake flour. It gives that perfect crumb and always real vanilla extract, never the fake stuff." She spoke as if listing virtues, not as if confessing. My chest dropped. She had just described the exact combination the lab found in the surveillance documents. I called Smith that night and explained what Karen had said. He listened, then answered carefully, It was compelling circumstantial evidence, but they needed more before making anything official. "Keep documenting her behavior," he warned. "Don't confront her directly, if she was involved. Discovering she'd been overheard could make her dangerous." The next day Tom came back with a stack of printouts and charts that looked like they belonged in an engineering briefing. He'd timed Karen's visits with the precision of someone who'd spent decades measuring systems. She'd entered our house 5 times over the past month, always during standard work hours when the house was empty, and every visit had lasted exactly 47 minutes. The consistency was unnerving. This wasn't casual nosiness. It looked like organized work, each stop a slot in a carefully scheduled procedure. Later that week 3 more men in uniform showed up at our door, claiming my wife had somehow escaped custody and needed to be reapprehended. Sarah had prepared for the possibility. She'd spent the day coordinating with Detective Smith, had her body camera running, and followed departmental protocols to the letter. Badge numbers, authorization codes, and supervising officer contact. "Hey now," she demanded with calm, unshakable authority. These imposters tried the same intimidation tactics they'd used before, but they were now confronting a detective who had rehearsed the exact steps needed to unmask them. Tom was already at his window with his phone. Within minutes half the street had cameras rolling. Neighbors streamed and recorded from porches and driveways. Even the reclusive Mr. Henderson watched from his lawn. The would-be actors found themselves performing not just for us, but for an audience of witnesses and digital records. Their composure dissolved as Sarah's questions revealed they lacked basic law enforcement knowledge. She called dispatch verification came back negative. As she read them, their rights, relief and pride washed through the blockade. This was our detective protecting the community with real training and procedure. The viral footage did more than vindicate Sarah. It prompted neighbors to come forward with stories they'd previously shrugged off. Mrs. Patterson remembered Karen pressuring her for a minute-by-minute schedule of when the house would be empty. The family across the street recalled invasive questions about vacation dates and alarm codes. Mr. Henderson admitted Karen had asked about his medical appointments and when his house would sit vacant. When Tom cross-referenced those accounts with his logs, a pattern emerged. Karen had been compiling detailed profiles of vulnerabilities, routines, access points for almost every household on the street. This wasn't nosiness, it was intelligence gathering. Detective Smith convened with Sarah and reviewed the growing pile of evidence. He laid out the implications plainly. The fake arrests were not isolated harassment. The scale, the planning, and the level of detail pointed to either an organized criminal group or someone abusing a position of neighborhood trust to prepare coordinated operations. The most chilling realization came when we overlaid Karen's visits, the timing of other suspicious entries in neighboring houses, and the window to when surveillance documents had been produced. The patterns matched too closely to be coincidence. Her movements synchronized with opportunities to scope homes, and the evidence suggested she had been transforming that access into actionable intelligence. The timeline of the imposter police incidents revealed something chilling. Karen had been compiling neighborhood intelligence for months before the first fake officers ever showed up. What happened to Sarah wasn't random harassment, it was part of a bigger plan. Karen wasn't just on the sidelines of these schemes, she was the architect, feeding information that made them possible. But why would someone with HOA authority conspire with criminals to target a detective and map out private family routines? That night, Sarah and Detective Smith worked out a strategy. They needed hard evidence, but discretion was critical. "We move carefully," Smith cautioned. "If Karen realizes we're closing in, she could escalate. We document, we act normal, and we gather enough to secure search warrants." By the time Smith left, the framework was set. Quiet resident interviews, preservation orders for data, synchronized requests from service providers, and a neighborhood log to track every unusual encounter. Ironically, the same watchful system Karen had used to pry into lives would now be turned against her. The real breakthrough came from Tom Miller. He stopped by with one more disturbing revelation from his system checks. "Michael, I wasn't sure whether to bring this up, it sounds so absurd, but Karen actually pushed me to install cameras aimed directly at your house," he admitted. "She called it community safety and even offered to cover part of the cost if I agreed to share the footage with her." Tom had refused, but he wondered aloud how many others might have complied. Why would she need to monitor us non-stop when she already had ways inside? The following Monday, Smith returned with a look that told me things had escalated beyond neighborhood drama. He held a real warrant, authorized judges, proper codes, all in line. "Mr. Thompson," he said firmly, "we now have authority to search Karen Wells's residence for unlawful entry and fraud. Unlike the phony documents the imposters had waved, this one would hold up in court." Smith laid out how the case had come together: Tom's footage, forensic results tying baking ingredients to surveillance papers, Karen's casual admissions, and neighbors' statements about her invasive questioning. "This is how it's done," Smith explained as we headed out. "Step by step, solid evidence, tight procedure." What we found inside Karen's house felt like a nightmare disguised as suburban order. A spare bedroom had been turned into an operations hub. File cabinets, wall charts, and color-coded systems. At the center sat a binder labeled Emergency Access Protocol, her way of making criminal surveillance look like official HOA safety measures. The discovery was staggering: master keys to 23 homes, each tagged with addresses and entry schedules. Detailed logs documented departure times, empty house durations, even weather notes that might affect visibility or noise. Tom's precise 47-minute window matched her records exactly, a proof she had honed her intrusions to perfection. The photos were the most unsettling: private family moments cataloged like exhibits, pictures of bedrooms, prescriptions, financial papers, alarm layouts, even blind spots in camera systems. It felt like someone had been living inside our walls, recording the most intimate parts of our lives. But Karen herself was gone. Neighbors reported seeing her loading suitcases and boxes into her SUV at dawn. Cameras caught her leaving just hours before the warrant was executed. Standing amid the labeled keys and meticulous notes, I felt a strange mix of relief and revulsion. Relief that the truth was finally exposed, and disgust at how easily trust had been weaponized. Smith remained steady, bagging evidence and photographing every page. "She can run," he muttered, "but the evidence stays, and it will follow her." The timing of her escape raised serious questions. How had she learned about the search? The warrant was locked down, handled by only a few. "Either we've got a leak," Smith said grimly, "or Karen has deeper connections than we thought." When Sarah came home and saw the files, she was shaken. "Michael, this isn't just a nosy neighbor. This is structured intelligence work, a professional, deliberate, and funded." The digital forensics team confirmed her suspicion. On Karen's computer were emails with a corporate entity, Riverside Development Group. The messages coordinated property assessments, resident profiling, and schedules adjusted around ongoing investigations. References to the fake police incidents were explicit. Deleted files hinted at acquisition targets and residential compliance monitoring, a language far more corporate than community-minded. That evening Tom helped match Karen's logs with his own footage. "Overlay her data with my recordings," he said, spreading diagrams across the table. "And she's been running this collection effort for at least a year and a half." This wasn't curiosity, it was a mission. The betrayal was devastating. How many times had she quietly entered our home? What private details had she documented? The thought made me feel violated today, as if hidden cameras had been planted, only worse, because we'd handed her access ourselves. Smith reassured us that her escape wouldn't block justice. The evidence supported major charges: unlawful entry, invasion of privacy, abuse of authority, conspiracy to defraud. He promised she wouldn't disappear unnoticed. "Operations this big leave trails," he said. "We'll flag her bank activity, track her communications, and coordinate with other jurisdictions." But the deeper concern was clear: Karen hadn't been acting alone. The ties to Riverside suggested her surveillance wasn't for curiosity or even personal gain, it was for business. Mapping vulnerabilities, assessing homes, and preparing entire neighborhoods for acquisition. Tom arrived again, this time with county land records in hand. His expression told us it was worse than we had feared. "Michael," he said, spreading stamped documents across the table, "since the warrant, I've been digging through property records, and I think I've found the reason Karen Wells was doing all of this." Tom spread the documents across our table, his finger landing on rezoning applications that explained everything. 18 months earlier, Riverside Development Group had filed to convert our neighborhood A along with 3 adjacent blocks A from residential housing into commercial land slated for demolition and redevelopment. Their glossy blueprints promised luxury condos and retail space, but what they really showed was our community erased for profit. This wasn't random harassment. And it wasn't some shadowy federal conspiracy. It was a local real estate play designed to force families into selling cheap. Karen's name appeared right in the filings, a community liaison in charge of transition coordination and acquisitions. In reality, she'd been running a property suppression scheme under the guise of neighborhood leadership. Tom walked us through her steps like it was a project plan. Phase 1. Climb into the whole leadership to gain trust, authority, and spare keys. Phase 2. Roll out the so-called emergency key program to normalize access and surveillance. Phase 3. Orchestrate harassment campaigns to push sales under market value. Phase 4. Funnel residents into Riverside's hands for quick acquisitions. The motive was simple: greed. Karen had a commission agreement with Riverside A, $5,000 for every $10,000 she shaved off a home's true value. With houses averaging around $300,000, she could clear $15,000 per property just by dragging a sale down $50,000. The spreadsheet Tom showed us targeted 47 homes. That translated into more than $700,000 in payouts for dismantling our neighborhood. I stared at the charts, arrows, and notes spread across the table. It looked less like real estate paperwork and more like an operations manual: cold, efficient, and clinical. Detective Smith arrived that evening to review Tom's findings alongside county planning officials. "Mr. Miller," he said gravely, "what you've uncovered reframes everything. We're not looking at one rogue neighbor. This is a coordinated fraud scheme that abuses local planning processes, manipulates families, and funnels profits into corporate development." The evidence revealed Karen had already succeeded in forcing out 8 families. Each had sold for far less than their homes were worth, and strangely enough, the neighborhood problems they'd endured stopped immediately after moving. Mrs. Carter, 2 blocks over, lost $60,000 off her sale after months of phony code violations and harassment calls. An elderly couple on Oak Street caved to a lowball offer after repeated tampering with their security system and threatening compliance letters. Even a young family on Maple Avenue, unnerved by a string of suspicious accidents, had been pressured into selling. That night Sarah examined the files with her professional eye. "Michael," she said, "the very structure of her operation makes it easier to prosecute. Criminals who keep patterns, document their activity, and run on schedules leave paper trails that build airtight cases." In other words, Karen had written the prosecution's case against herself, but the betrayal still cut deep. We had trusted Karen. She had smiled, baked cookies, and played the part of a helpful neighbor, all while laying the groundwork to uproot us for cash. It felt like discovering a relative had been secretly plotting against the family. Every gesture of kindness had been part of the con. Tom's deeper digging revealed this wasn't even her first rodeo. Payment records showed Karen had been working with Riverside for years, pulling similar schemes in at least 3 other neighborhoods. Each one had ended the same way: residents displaced, properties bought cheap, and the land redeveloped at a massive profit. She wasn't dabbling in shady behavior. She was a seasoned operator in professional real estate fraud. Smith wasted no time looping in federal authorities. "This has escalated beyond local jurisdiction," he explained. "We're dealing with organized fraud, housing manipulation, and abuse of authority on a scale that crosses state and federal law." The investigation now stretched far beyond our block. The most chilling discovery was that our neighborhood wasn't Karen's first victim, it was her 4th. Records showed she'd served as an HOA officer in 3 other areas that were later bulldozed and rebuilt under Riverside. With that pattern in hand, the scope of her work was undeniable. Karen had refined her methods community by community, leaving a trail of destruction behind her. That Friday evening, just as we began to feel the net tightening, our doorbell rang. At 7:30 sharp, Karen Wells stood on the porch. She looked nothing like the polished woman who had once brought us cookies. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair disheveled, her face lined with exhaustion and manic determination. After a week of hiding and watching her empire collapse in headlines and neighborhood gossip, she had returned with desperation in her eyes. "Sarah, Michael, we need to talk right now," she shouted through the door, her voice unsteady but edged with rage. "You've destroyed everything I've built over the past 2 years. We have to fix this before it spirals out of control." Her words dripped with entitlement, as though her crimes were justified and we were the ones at fault for exposing them. This wasn't the friendly neighbor anymore. The mask was gone, revealing the predator beneath. Sarah hit record on her phone while I dialed Detective Smith just as we'd agreed to if Karen showed up. Sarah's voice was steady, authoritative. "Karen, you're wanted for questioning in connection with real estate fraud and unauthorized property access. You need to surrender to the authorities and speak through your attorney. Trying to intimidate witnesses will only add to your charges." But Karen was past the point of reason, her voice rising to a near scream. "I improved this neighborhood," she ranted. "I got rid of families who didn't belong here. I raised property values. I created opportunities for growth, and you ruined everything because you couldn't see the bigger picture." Her words twisted reality into delusion. She truly believed harassment, surveillance, and forced displacement were community improvements. Tom Miller, who had been monitoring from his own house, stepped outside. His voice was calm but firm, the way an engineer dismantles a faulty design. "Karen, you terrorized 47 families for commissions. You ran surveillance, broke privacy laws, and colluded with criminals to harass an officer. That isn't development, it's organized crime dressed up as neighborhood service." Tom's meticulous documentation had been the key to unraveling Karen's scheme, and hearing him confront her with the hard, undeniable math of her crimes was immensely satisfying. Karen's response revealed the disdain she truly felt for the people she had pretended to represent. "You're too ignorant to understand real estate development and market strategy," she screamed, her voice shrill with rage. "I was building opportunities for transformation worth millions, but you're too blind to recognize sophisticated planning." The mask had completely fallen away. To her, we weren't neighbors, so we were obstacles. "I spent 2 years compiling resident profiles, tracking weaknesses, and working with development professionals to create the perfect operation," she ranted, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she was confessing to multiple felonies while being recorded. But Detective Thompson couldn't keep out of things and disrupted legitimate initiatives meant to improve the community. She twisted harassment and intimidation into consulting. Within minutes, Detective Smith arrived with backup, having been alerted by Tom about Karen's outburst. His voice was firm and final as he declared, "Karen Wells, you're under arrest for real estate fraud, criminal harassment, unlawful property access, and conspiracy across 3 neighborhoods." The relief in the room was palpable. After weeks of fear, fake police encounters, and the sickening betrayal of realizing our trusted neighbor had been dismantling our lives, justice was finally arriving. Even as Smith read her rights, Karen tried one last desperate bluff. "You think locking me up ends this?" she shouted defiantly. "Riverside Development has contracts in 6 other neighborhoods with entire teams of acquisition specialists working projects worth hundreds of millions. This case will be buried by people with more power than small-town cops can handle." The implication was chilling. Karen wasn't an isolated criminal, she was part of a larger machine. How many other communities were being infiltrated? How many families were living through the same nightmare? That thought made me sick to my stomach, but it also steeled my resolve. We weren't just going to stop Karina, we were going to expose the entire network behind her. That night, Sarah and Smith worked together to broaden the scope of the case beyond Karen's personal involvement, shifting focus onto Riverside Development Group and their connected partners. "Michael," Sarah explained, reviewing the recording of Karen's rant, her own bragging about multiple specialists and ongoing projects means we're looking at something much bigger than us. We'll need state and federal investigators with the reach to dismantle this entire enterprise and protect other neighborhoods. Processing the betrayal of someone we had trusted was painful enough, but realizing that neighborhood destruction had been industrialized into a business model was staggering. Karen hadn't just targeted USA, she had been perfecting tactics for years. Resident profiling, identifying vulnerabilities, fabricating compliance issues, staging fake official visits, and exploiting paperwork to corner homeowners. Our ordeal was just one version of a blueprint already in motion elsewhere. If her claims about Riverside were true, Dozens and maybe hundreds of families were trapped in the same cycle of harassment and coercion. That knowledge sharpened our purpose. We collected every detail, preserved statements, and built an airtight package of evidence to hand over to investigators who could trace the scheme on a regional scale. Karen's arrogance, her own files, and her carelessness had given us the map to dismantle the network. The neighborhood rallied. People cross-checked suspicious letters, saved phone records, kept copies of code violation notices, and archived footage from their cameras. Within days, what once looked like random harassment crystallized into a clear strategy we could present to prosecutors. Tom spent the evening cataloging evidence with Smith, integrating data from his security system to support the expanding case. His analysis was sharp as ever. The consistency in Karen's documentation shows she was following a standard procedure, not just improvising. Tom explained, this kind of precision points to training, resources, and a support network far beyond a single rogue actor. As Smith secured Karen in cuffs, she screamed, "Riverside won't let this investigation touch their projects. I'm just one acquisition specialist." Her words echoed in my head. How many more Karens were out there, embedded in neighborhoods, weaponizing trust for profit? When someone you believe to be a friend betrays not just you but your entire community for money, it changes everything. It turned out Karen's obsessive record-keeping had unintentionally created a manual, a step-by-step guide that Riverside and other developers were reportedly using to train new acquisition specialists. Her files outlined exactly how to infiltrate neighborhood leadership, conduct surveillance, manufacture conflicts, and drag property values down through staged disruption. The scale of the scheme was far beyond what we once thought when all we saw were fake officers who seemed to know our routines a little too well. By fighting back, we had derailed a carefully planned timeline meant to fracture our community, push out 47 families, and turn the land into luxury profits. Other neighborhoods hadn't been as fortunate. Some lacked the law enforcement instincts Sarah brought as a detective. Others were too isolated, intimidated before they ever had the chance to resist. Detective Smith began coordinating with state investigators to probe what now looked like a multi-county pattern. Karen's confessions linked our ordeal to similar operations in other areas. The evidence shows this kind of systematic harassment for property acquisition has become a business model, Smith explained. We're now working with state authorities to identify targeted communities and build coordinated prosecutions. It was a bittersweet victory. Our stand had protected one block, but the trail of evidence pointed to countless families quietly enduring the same pressure, without realizing it was part of a calculated design. Most people believe their street is too ordinary to be targeted. Yet, corporations dressed up as legitimate developers were hiring professionals to break apart neighborhoods, refining their methods until they blended into the background of everyday life. The only real defense was resistance armed with documentation, support networks, and the right allies in law enforcement. Tom Miller's analytical approach had been critical in exposing Karen's operation. His meticulous records didn't just help our neighborhood, they supported a broader case against a much larger network. Michael, this shows why it's so important for communities to document suspicious patterns and work together, Tom noted. Individual families might think what they're experiencing is just bad luck, but when neighbors pool information, a bigger picture emerges, and so do the perpetrators. Investigators soon discovered Riverside had placed similar community specialists in at least 4 other counties, each using nearly identical harassment tactics. The question became, how wide did this network reach? Months later, the courthouse overflowed with families from multiple neighborhoods when Karen Wells finally faced sentencing. She stood trial for real estate fraud, criminal harassment, unlawful property access, and conspiracy across communities. Judge Miller had reviewed stacks of evidence, testimony from more than 40 families, and expert analysis of her systematic campaign before delivering judgment. Karen Wells, the judge declared, "You are sentenced to 3 years in county jail, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and mandatory community service focused on housing advocacy and resident protection." The punishment went far beyond prison time. The state real estate board revoked her license permanently, banning her from ever handling property transactions or holding authority in a community setting again. On top of that, A $150,000 civil judgment required her to pay restitution to the very families she had tried to exploit. The financial blow ensured she'd have no resources to fuel similar schemes in the future. Her personal world also collapsed. Court records revealed her husband filed for divorce, citing her deception and harassment as grounds, and sought custody of their children. Even her adult children from a prior marriage publicly condemned her actions. The clubs and community groups she once belonged to expelled her, implementing stricter safeguards to prevent infiltration by anyone with hidden agendas. Detective Smith later returned to her home with a real search warrant, a legitimate codes, a real judge, the proper jurisdiction. Unlike the fakes we had once faced, this one carried the full weight of the law. Inside Karen's house, we found what could only be described as a suburban intelligence center. Filing cabinets, wall charts, and color-coded systems lined the walls. At the core was a binder titled Emergency Access Protocol, carefully crafted to disguise unlawful surveillance as safety measures. Drawers held master keys to 23 homes, each labeled with addresses and schedules. Logs tracked when families left for work, how long homes stayed empty, even seasonal notes about when streets were quieter. Karen had refined the timing down to the minute, ensuring she could slip in, search, and vanish without detection. She convinced residents to hand over emergency keys, Smith explained, snapping photos, then used fake authority to justify property checks and intelligence gathering. The most disturbing finds were the photographs, private bedrooms, medicine cabinets, tax records, alarm layouts, even diagrams marking blind spots on security cameras. It was invasive to a degree that made my stomach turn. Realizing a neighbor had been treating our lives like case files was like being shoved backward. It made the very walls of our homes feel violated. But Karen was already gone. Word spread that she had slipped out at dawn, loading her car with boxes. Tom's cameras confirmed her SUV leaving around 6:30 a.m., just hours before the warrant was served. Standing in that room of labeled keys and stolen secrets, I felt both relief and revulsion. Relief that the truth was exposed, and revulsion at how easily trust had been twisted into access. Smith remained steady as ever, bagging drives, photographing logs, and packing files. "She can run," he said quietly, "but the evidence stays." For the first time, I believed this nightmare would truly end and that our community might finally breathe again. The long-term impact went beyond Karen's downfall. We built networks to share information, track suspicious incidents, and guard against harassment campaigns, all while preserving normal neighborhood trust. Tom designed communication systems that let residents spot patterns without slipping into paranoia. The balance was simple but vital: remain watchful, but not fearful. Real leadership, we learned, protects privacy, property, and peace of mind. When neighbors look out for each other honestly, fake authority loses all power. That's the real story here at Ya Stories. Genuine communities are built on trust, not manipulation. If this story opened your eyes to the importance of vigilance in your own neighborhood, remember to stay alert. I'll see you next time, with another reminder that truth is often stranger than fiction. Until then, keep your neighborhood safe and your trust wisely placed.